So, oh, you know what? That wasn't the right time to switch the slides, but that's okay. So I will welcome everyone again to the AMATIC 2019 webinar series. My name is John Oakes, and I am the interim AMATIC Professional Development Coordinator. And today's webinar is on relational strategies and promising practices in math instruction. And our lovely presenters are going to introduce themselves in a moment. So I will remind all of you that the views expressed by the presenter are not necessarily the views of AMATIC, and any commercial products mentioned by the presenters are not endorsed by AMATIC. And McGraw-Hill Higher Education is proud to support the 2019 AMATIC webinar series. And now we will switch to the presenter slide. So if you haven't already welcomed the presenters in the chat room, please feel free to do so now. And I am going to turn it over to Helen and all of the rest of the presenters today right now.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Helen Byrne, and I'm happy to be here. Thank you very much, John, for a wonderful introduction. The title of today's talk is Relational Strategies and Promising Practices in Mathematics Instruction. I am the chair of the Pathways Joint Subcommittee for AMATIC, which is sponsoring this, and I'm here with Dr. Gabrielle Gerhardt and Darielle Blevins, who I'm going to introduce in just a moment. I wanted to start with some acknowledgments. I want to thank AMATIC. The material that we're going to share with you today emerged from an NSF grant titled Transitioning Learners to Calculus in Community Colleges. We affectionately call that TLC3. The goal of that project is to improve student learning and student outcomes in the STEM math pathway, particularly for historically underrepresented groups. AMATIC has been very supportive of that effort in supporting and endorsing our national survey, which some of you may have filled out. We also have a project called Calculus Allies, and we do presentations at their annual conference. So thank you, AMATIC. I am a mathematics education researcher and a mathematics faculty at Highline College, which is in the Seattle area. And the TLC3 research team is very diverse, unique, and it's interdisciplinary. It includes people like me that are mathematics educators, as well as Dr. Vilma Mesa from the University of Michigan. But what's unique is we also brought in people from the field of community college student success research. And we have two teams. One is from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, that is led by Dr. Zamani Gallagher. And we also have a group from San Diego State, which is overseen by Dr. Luke Wood. And Darielle is a graduate student at San Diego State, and she's also an instructor at Miracosta College. Dr. Gerhardt, who's here today, is a consultant on the grant, and she is an educational researcher, and she also teaches at Seattle Central College here in Seattle. And of course, we want to thank the National Science Foundation for their support. For an outline of today, I'm going to do an introductory activity and make some connections between the topic of this webinar and mathematics pathways. Then I'm going to turn it over to Darielle Blevins, who's going to describe these relational and promising practices that we're bringing into this grant, and she's going to talk about the research behind those. And then I'm going to come back and show you how these practices showed up in our data that we collected through classroom observations in the TLC3 project. And then we're shooting for having 10 to 15 minutes of Q&A. Throughout the webinar, we invite you to share in the chat window. Dr. Gerhardt's going to monitor the window throughout the webinar, and we can address your questions during the Q&A. So feel free to just write and share in there, and remember to send the message to all panelists and participants. So to get us warmed up today, I know many of you I saw are from the East Coast. I'm from the West Coast, so it's only noonish here, but I want you to kind of ground yourself in this topic. So I'd like you to imagine that you're observing a colleague teaching math and you like what you see. So maybe what you're looking at is you notice that they're using good examples, or the problems worked, good choice of problems worked. Or maybe you're noticing that there's an appropriate level of the challenge in the course. Or maybe you notice this person is good at explaining, or they use in-class questions very effectively. These are things that we typically observe in a math classroom. But I want you to think about other things that might be happening that give you the sense that this is good teaching. And these are more of the relational parts of teaching and the focus of today's webinar. So maybe you notice there's this culture of welcomeness in the class. Or you notice that this faculty member is good at monitoring students' performance during class, or giving positive messaging to students. Or maybe they're connecting the mathematics to students' lives through culturally relevant teaching. These 4 topics that I've just listed, these are strategies that faculty can use to engage students in class. So the big picture here is to try to increase student engagement. There's decades of research that shows that when students are engaged, they learn more, they persist more, which means they graduate at higher rates. So engagement is key. Now, Daryl Blevins is also going to show how these items have been shown to enhance the outcomes for students from historically underserved groups. But before we get to that, I want to explain that today we're going to focus on 2, because we only have an hour: culture of welcomeness and performance monitoring. And I want to explain the connection of this to mathematics pathways. So my claim is mathematics pathways is going to increase the need for faculty-student interactions. And I'm going to give you 3 examples of that. On the one hand, students are going to need our help in understanding and buying into mathematics pathways. This is true for students who are coming from high school, but also students who are returning. Things like direct placement into college math, accelerating through the dev math sequence, contextualized learning. These are all things that are going to be unfamiliar to most students. And the practices that we discuss here can help us build a classroom culture where students can view us as a resource to help them navigate this new terrain. Another area is in identifying prerequisite knowledge in co-requisite courses. This is a really big deal. In co-requisite models, we can, of course, identify some prerequisite needs in advance that we know students will have to learn, but there's going to be a lot of live learning going on in class where it's going to be up to us to use in-class interactions with students as an opportunity to identify additional prerequisite needs and also to more effectively monitor their performance in reaching the college level goals. And lastly, it was predicted, and the data is starting to show, that when we design mathematics pathways, additional interventions are needed for students who place into the lowest levels of mathematics. These are students for whom direct placement into college might not be possible, acceleration models might not be an appropriate strategy. So the enhanced strategies that we discussed here can be incorporated into these interventions to better serve these students who need the most support. Now I'm going to turn it over to Darielle, who's going to explain the research behind these promising practices.
I'm Darielle. I'm a research associate at San Diego State, and like Helen mentioned, I teach a community college here in San Diego. I'm going to start off by talking about the development of some of the practices that Helen mentioned and the research in which these practices are grounded in. So I wanted to begin with the framework for faculty-student engagement, in which these practices that we're going to be talking about today are contextualized within. So if you look to the left, we start with relational strategies, because we believe that students, especially underrepresented students, thrive when their education is situated within a relationship. And so one practice that we'll focus on today is the culture of welcomeness, right? Welcomeness to engage inside the classroom. Next is epistemology, and this is just thinking about how instructors view their students and their students' learning. And then we have our teaching strategies, and at the top you see performance monitoring, which we'll focus on. And these instructional strategies have been seen to be predictive of success for students of color. The confluence of all of these practices together, we've seen really lead to persistence, achievement, and attainment. And this framework was originally created with men of color in mind, but we've seen that it's successful for many underrepresented groups. And I'll explain more about that as we go. Can we move to the next slide? Uh-oh. Next, I'm going to talk about more about the development of these practices and where they're documented. So many of them are documented in this guidebook that you see here. It's the Teaching Men of Color in Community College, and it was written by Wood, Harris, and White. The framework that I showed you before is also included in this guidebook. And so they began their research with just an extensive literature review. So looking at what practice best facilitates success, particularly for men of color. They then elicited student voice. And so they have narratives of success, mostly for this study for Black and Latino men. So they interviewed current students, just asking what factors currently help them be successful students. So what helps you as you transition into university? Faculty voice was also very important. They elicited narratives from educators who had a documented record of success in teaching and supporting underserved students, and they were identified by administrators at their college. They use quantitative data. So this book in particular focuses on student perspectives of campus ethos that assess faculty members' relationships, but there's also data about faculty practices, and I'll talk about that a little bit more. So next, I'll give you an overview of the surveys that were used to collect this data. Next slide. So first we have the CCSM, and then we have the CCIDI. And these two surveys are part of what we call the institutional assessment package. We also have the CCSSI. And so the quantitative data were derived from these surveys. They came out of the SEAL lab where I work, and the Community College Student Success Inventory, which is the first one, is called our campus self-assessment. Usually just a small group of admin will get together and complete this survey to influence some of their decision making. And when you look at the CCSM, which is in the middle, we call that the student survey. And this is meant to identify factors influencing the success for underserved students. This is administered as a Scantron survey in class, and all students complete it. And the outcomes from this survey is represented in the guidebook. And this survey is where we ask students about their beliefs about their instructors, welcoming them to engage. If you look at the CCIDI, which we the professional development needs and programming needs for campuses and for community colleges, campuses and departments. And here is where we do look at the epistemology, the relational strategies, and the teaching practices that faculty are using. It is distributed online, and its initial distribution was given to over 1,700 instructors, and that was from the previous slide. So I can give a little more of a definition of welcomeness to engage, as well as performance monitoring and what those mean when we use those phrases. So we'll start with relational strategies, because as I mentioned before, we believe for underrepresented students, especially men of color and women of color and our LGBT students, that they thrive academically when they are in a relationship with their faculty. And so they really need these relationships to then feel comfortable and safe to engage in the learning process. And so if you see the phrase welcomeness to engage, you might think about being welcoming, maybe think about like being nice to your students or welcoming students as they enter the classroom, which are all great practices. But when we're thinking about this, we're thinking about it as a function of creating classroom climate. So are you really creating a climate which students are comfortable and are feeling like they are welcome to engage with the instructor, right? And so this is also taking a differential view on engagement. So oftentimes when we think about engagement, there may be an assumption that all students have equal access or an equal opportunity to engage with instructors. And in our research, we don't make that assumption. Instead, we think of instead of asking our students engaging, so sometimes we ask, are students asking questions? Are students responding to questions? We ask, do students actually feel welcome to do those things? So our instructors actively welcoming students to participate in classroom discussions? Are they creating an environment in which students understand that they can ask their professor about their grade? And so it's much more in creating an environment that welcomes student engagement. And so we see this being done through open nonverbal communication and also inviting verbal communication. Also, as Helen mentioned, we focus on positive messaging. So when we're talking about our underrepresented students, we understand that they may be coming to us having heard negative messages about themselves and their identities as students. And so we want to encourage instructors to counter those narratives in your classroom is by critiquing privately and praising publicly. You praise publicly so that all students can. I'll continue to the next slide. I think we may have lost some of connection, so I'll repeat my last.
Yeah, that's fine, Darielle. It cut out a little bit.
It cut out. Should I repeat the last about
Yeah,
critiquing?
that last bullet about critiquing privately, praise publicly.
Okay, no problem. So my last point about critiquing privately and praising publicly is that this was really key in interviews. And so we want to critique privately, which means it's done within a one-on-one conversation with a student. You don't have to hold back your feedback to students, but to do it one-on-one to really maintain their dignity. And to praise publicly, not only to validate that one student, but praising publicly also continues to add to this welcomeness environment for all students, because now they hear that their efforts will be validated. Really focusing in on the increasing motivational messaging, we want to focus on validating students' work ethic, validating their resilience in coming to class, and really affirming that they have a positive future at school and throughout their lives, right? And in doing this, we really believe that students need to hear these following messages. They need to hear that they belong, that the work is something that they can do and they can handle, that they can succeed in it, and that they're actually intelligent. So we found that underrepresented students, particularly these men of color, had never heard these statements coming from educators. And so it's important for us to counter those narratives with these narratives. The last point would be just to avoid unintentional micromessaging. So a barrier to creating a welcoming environment is actually invalidating students and their experiences and their identities. So one thing that some instructors do is show this very surprised at a student being articulate or surprised at a student being good at math, and that surprise actually ends up invalidating the student. And so we also see that some instructors, if they're overly reliant on the idea of being colorblind and treating students equally, that sometimes students who have experienced racism or oppression feel like now their stories are being invalidated. So just being careful as to what message are we sending with the words that we use. Next, I'm going to talk about the promising teaching practice of performance monitoring. And first, I want to say that at performance monitoring's core is our belief in institutional responsibility. So this is the idea that educators and administrators have a responsibility to facilitate the success, especially for underrepresented students. So sometimes if we see low outcomes for our underrepresented students, we begin to look for ways to fix the student, right? Or begin to look at maybe what happened in their family or what happened in their community. We kind of want to flip that idea and ask, what are we as an institution doing, or as a college, or as a department, or in your classroom, that may be resulting in these underrepresented students not doing as well as we want them to. Right? And so what our data shows is that having this mindset of institutional responsibility has a direct connection to student success. And so performance monitoring is taking a step towards the student and opening the opportunity for success. It's really asking instructors to be proactive in addressing concerns before they become a larger issue, right? This is monitoring things like attendance and assignment outcomes. It's really encouraging students who we know are on the margins and just knowing when to step in. In making a connection, I just wanted to, in my last point, make a connection about early alerts. So many campuses are moving to an early alert system, which we think is definitely rooted in the idea of institutional responsibility, and that these are some key predictors of student course success that instructors could be aware of that we may not always be aware of. And two that I wanted to hone in on are students arriving to class late or leaving class early. So these can be indicators that something else is happening. And I just wanted to go back and make that connection to, it's easier to inquire about these things with a student if you have a relationship with them. So I'm going to pass it back to Helen now, and she's going to take us through some of the data that came out of the current study that we're doing.
Wonderful. Thank you, Darielle. Your work is so important, and I'm so happy that this is our opportunity to start to bring this work from the community college student success literature into the mathematics education world. So thank you so much. And I am going to ask you a little bit later in a slide to chime in on an idea. Before I get to what did the practices look like in action in the TLC3 research case, I want to talk about the sources of data. So in our project, we started with a national survey of community college mathematics chairs. Gabrielle just put a link to that national survey, the technical report and just basic survey summary in the chat window. And that tried to figure out what are people doing now in the STEM math pathway in terms of program structures and instructional strategies. What are they doing now? And then we followed that up with case studies, and we visited 4 minority serving institutions to try to unpack, like, to what extent are these efforts supporting students from historically underrepresented groups? We visited a Hispanic serving institution, a predominantly Black institution, a tribal college, and then an Anapizi college. That's a broad designation, Asian American, Native American, Pacific Islander, and we visited a college that had a high Southeast Asian American community. The case studies is where the data is coming from that we're going to show you in a moment. These cases were selected mainly based on state level math data, responses to our national survey, and we were looking for colleges that were close to a transfer institution because we assumed that then they would have kind of a STEM math pipeline. We in total observed 26 classes across the whole STEM math sequence, because in community colleges you have to include dev math in that. And we had 2 observers in the classroom. One person was observing the classes looking for kind of mathematical stuff. If you think back to that first activity that I had you engage in, you're observing a colleague. You know, what kind of questions are being asked? What are the explanations like? Are they dealing with relevance? But the other observer was paying specific attention to these practices that Darielle described. So 2 of us were there. And in my case, Gabrielle, who's with us today, was observing the relational practices, and I was focused on the mathematical practices. Each of us took field notes during our observations, and then afterwards we had an online form with common prompts, and we uploaded our field notes. And then the 3 of us here, Gabrielle and Darielle and I, engaged in some qualitative analysis to identify some themes. So I'm going to start with welcomeness to engage. And I'm going to say, what we're showing you here is what we saw in the classrooms. We're not putting these forth as the best or most promising practices, or that they're even, getting into the depth of what Darielle shared. But this is what we saw, and we have a few comments. So welcomeness to engage. Across the 26 classes that we observed, 81% of the observers reported that they thought there was a welcomeness to engage, a culture of welcomeness in the class. 2 neutral and 3 disagreed. And we drew out 3 themes from this. The one that we'd like to share with you, the first is what we call the basics of welcomeness. Then we're going to talk about the physical aspects of welcomeness. and then welcomeness to engage in mathematics. And here, as we go through these, if anything resonates with you or if you have additional ideas, please put them in the chat window so that we can capture your wonderful ideas. So the basics of welcomeness. I'm going to go through these quickly. These are probably things you already know. Being on time or early to class. This is what we observed. Interacting with students as they entered the class. We observed faculty asking things like, "How are you?" Using student names. Smiling. Now, smiling may not be natural to all of us, but it definitely is something that indicates that you're happy to be there and you're happy that they're there. People observed that there was a relaxed atmosphere in class, and we even saw people, like in my case, we observed early in the term, the faculty were helping students with registration and wait lists, giving them signals that they were welcomed and they were happy to be there. And at the end of the course, they would say things like, "Take care, have a great day" at the end of class. So we call these the basics of welcomeness. Next, we'll share some physical aspects that the observers recorded in the classrooms that they observed. Looking at students when they ask a question. When someone asks a question, pointing and saying yes to physically acknowledge a student when they respond. Open postures. Some faculty, even the observers, noted that they made a point of trying not to turn their back to students, like when they're working at the board. Tone of voice can indicate welcomeness. And next, faculty tended to spend class time where students worked on problems during class. And this is a very typical practice that's been noted in our field. And Gabrielle just posted an article that I wrote with Vilma Mesa around this. It's very common for us to spend time in class, giving students time to work on problems during class. And during that time, there's physical aspects. You can walk around and openly engage with students while they work on problems, leaning in when working with students during that kind of work. So giving students these signals that you're welcoming their engagement. Now, welcomeness usually, in the literature Darielle talked about, suggests welcomeness to engage with us. We have to give students signals that we want them. You are invited to engage and your engagement is desired. But we also want to kind of push it a little bit and talk about, we saw some evidence of welcomeness to engage in the mathematics. Okay, so here we go. We saw instructors acknowledging the material may be complicated, but telling students they could get it. They spoke one-on-one with students around a mathematics problem to keep them engaged in the problem. Now we're going to turn to some language things that we saw. People use language strategically to get students into the problem, encouraging students to take a shot at a problem. Or another instructor used the roles and said, let's get some more people in here, getting more people to engage, using the role. And that can mitigate that tendency for a few students to dominate. Validating an approach a student has taken, like factoring, I like it, or another instructor, like cute what you did over there. Another guy was like touchdown when a student did well. So positive language, getting students into the problem. And then lastly, and this is a really big deal, and it connects to that praise publicly, critique privately, like when students make a mistake, how do we frame it so that we keep the students engaged? So here's an example of an instructor who said, it's not you, it's hard, you can do this. Or another where they were doing group work on the board or individual work on the board and they're making graphs and the instructor said, your graph can be funky and you can still get the answer. So that's the end of the welcomeness. I'm going to move over to performance monitoring as our second area of practice. And across the observations, 92% of the observers agreed that faculty engaged in performance monitoring in class. And the three main themes that we're going to draw out here are they did reminding, they asked questions, and they circulated and checked students' work. And again, that was during this in-class problem solving. So we're going to take each of these in turn. I'm going to start with reminding. So we're going to show you what did they remind them about. They reminded them about course logistics, due dates, where to find things, where to find a current grade. They reminded them about resources, tutoring center, office hours. And they also reminded them of what we're calling performance expectation. They reminded them about expectations around showing work, that these are key steps. This technique is important, or you're going to need this, or this is the hardest thing that's going to be on the test. These kinds of reminders was a main form of performance monitoring. We have two comments here. The first one I'm going to handle is, we talked about, as we were analyzing the data, what you remind is different than how you remind. So there's a lot of things that students need reminding of, and some of it could be said verbally, some of it could be written on the board, or you could do it through email. So there are many strategies for reminding students. Now I'm going to just turn it back to Darielle for a minute to talk about this tendency of some student groups to be hesitant to seek help, regardless of the fact that you might remind them.
Yeah, so I can add, especially with the work that we've been doing around men of color, we find that there's an idea, or there's a socialization of boys and men, that they don't need to ask for help, or that asking for help might be some negative reflection of their masculinity. And so we don't want to reinforce that, but we want to be aware that that might be something that they're battling, and having these reminders, especially in the context of an open relationship with that student, may help them be able to seek this help. And so I can go a little bit more into it. We think about having an intrusive practice. So part of performance monitoring is being intrusive. So taking a step forward towards a student and letting them know that it's okay for them to come ask for help, which is also countering a lot of the negative message, especially that men have received, especially Black and Latino men. And we also see that this may be possible for Southeast Asian men, that they think that it's either a sign of weakness for them as men to be asking for help. So not exactly reinforcing that idea, but knowing that that may be something that your students are struggling with.
Thank you, Dario.
Mm-hmm.
And in my case, I visited the college that has a high Southeast Asian American student population. And what the literature would suggest for that student group, without being stereotypical, we never mean all when we say these things, but generally, many times these students can suffer what's called the model minority myth, where because they're Asian, they're presumed to be good at math. It's a complete stereotype, but that can affect their tendency to want to show up at a tutoring center or to go to a faculty office hours for help, because they know, in fact, oftentimes the research shows that students ask them for help just because they're Asian. So the faculty I talked to in my case definitely were aware of needing to give these students an extra nudge to get them to take advantage of resources, and that they couldn't be presumed to be doing just fine because they weren't asking for help. Our next area, and of course we encourage, please put any comments you have in the chat window. The next area to talk about is performance monitoring and how students ask questions. This is a classic way to monitor students' performance in class. On the one hand, we had some examples of what we'd call more complex questions, which would require a bit of back and forth with the instructor, asking about what something meant, or, hey, is it acceptable to do a particular step next in a problem, or can I reverse these steps, or asking students directly, how do you see that? These required somewhat of an extended interaction between the faculty and the students. But generally, we didn't see complex questions in the classroom as much as we saw quick back and forth check-in type questions, where you're at the board and you're doing a quick check-in. Hey, got that? Everything okay? Does this look okay? Like quick, you shout out to the whole class. This is a very common feature of our instruction that we observed. We have some comments about that. Check-in questions definitely have a place. They help to affirm that students are following and keeping up with the presentation, kind of quick banter back and forth. However, these questions alone really are not enough to truly monitor performance of all students. Lastly, we would present ideas about performance monitoring, which happened when people were walking around and checking students' work. So what we saw in terms of monitoring performance was instructors would offer guidance and assistance. Okay, wait, you've gone too far, don't simplify, or you need to do this, helping students out during class, offering guidance and assistance. Kind of interesting that we saw some really good examples of where the instructor would take on the responsibility for the confusion. And this goes back to this idea of how to do positive messaging and praise publicly, but critique privately. So one instructor was like, I'm the instructor, I'm feeling a roadblock, let's do another one. Or I think we need a little more. And please, if you have other linguistic strategies for helping your students, please put them in the chat window. We also here, it comes back to you can see how these practices overlap with the welcomeness, how to effectively handle student mistakes or misunderstandings. An instructor who definitely saw he was doing something with like terms, are these two like terms? And he said, I hear a like and an unlike. I want to hear a justification for both. So you're not giving a right or wrong answer, you're engaging the students and getting them to justify their answers. And as we leave this section, I would comment that as we were analyzing this data, we're thinking about, students can monitor each other's performance as they help each other. And in Darielle's case, she had an instructor who was very strategic with their use of pair work. Like once the students were done, the instructor would say, hey, start working with someone else. That way the instructor could see how the students were progressing. So you don't have to be the only one monitoring the performance. In terms of summarizing and then opening up for questions, in the webinar today, we talked about 2 relational or promising practices. One was welcomeness to engage and the other performance monitoring. We talked about the basics, physical aspects, and getting students to welcome them to engage in the mathematics. And then we talked about reminding, questioning, circulating, and checking students' work as the main ways that we saw in our study that faculty monitored performance in class. These practices can help increase student engagement in all classes, but I would make the claim that they are going to be increasingly important for math pathways courses for those reasons I mentioned before. These practices are shown to have an enhanced effect on the success of students from historically underserved groups. And now we're going to open it up to questions. And I'm going to turn it over to Gabrielle to help monitor some that may have already come through, or you can feel free to ask new ones. Gabrielle, if you want to unmute.
All right, we don't have any questions yet, but I'm going to post a couple of questions here. So here's one. What do you do to welcome and invite students to engage? Do you have some suggestions or ideas that are a little different from what we've said? Or how do you respond to what we've shared from our findings on the study? And then the next, are there other ways you monitor students' understanding and performance? We'd be very interested in that. If there's other techniques that people use when they're in the classroom working with students. All right, we know you're out there. Should we give everyone a minute, Helen, and we'll see if we get a question?
Absolutely.
Okay, great. So I know we had a question earlier. I believe it was from Steve. Was that you, Steve? You talked about, you mentioned the book, The College Fear Factor. Do you have any ways you were thinking about, sorry to call on you directly, that you were connecting what you mentioned in your post there and how what we talked about? All right, here we have a question, which this question was just posted to all panelists. So let's see, we have something from Steve, and we have another question here. Steve talked about transitioning, you can read his comment here, from a professorial model to a relational model, focusing on the whole student. I don't think we use that term, Darielle, focusing on the whole student. Would you have any response to that? And then we have another one.
I think it's worth, I like that idea of linking this to college fear factor. In fact, I recommend everyone think about getting teaching men of color in community colleges, so it's so powerful, but this one really rocked me when it came out, in 2010 or so.
Yeah.
That it just exposed what our students are feeling inside in terms of the imposter syndrome, their lack of belonging, not feeling like they're college material, and that can explain a lot of their behaviors rather than just having a deficit model on the students. So they're not turning things in because they don't have some kind of a work ethic. There's often things going on in their lives, and it's really important for us to not judge people and to develop ways to engage with students that keep them engaged, because we just really never know what's going on.
So we have a couple more comments here. I will just read one. I believe this is Shane calling on students to give random numbers to generate rational functions in class. So having people toss those out, that sounds great. And then one more, let's see, where someone uses a technique that says, can you say it or explain it differently? So that sounds like a powerful way to work with students in class. Maybe when they give you an answer, come back and ask them to say or explain it differently.
So that would be an example, Gabrielle, I'm assuming, of where they're on the wrong track. But you don't want to shut them down, you want to keep them engaged. So
I think it could be used that way. That's not how it was offered in the comment, which didn't go to everyone. So I'm kind of paraphrasing there, but that phrase is exactly how they phrased it. Yes. So that would be great if you wanted them to kind of stay on the track here. So here's another one. I'll read some of these, so maybe they'll come through on the recording. Do you have more information on specifics of how programs such as mentoring help alleviate stress, help alleviate some of these issues, or what about online classes? So that's looking at mentoring as a way to help students. And we didn't really discuss the idea of online classes. All the classes we observed were face-to-face classes, so that would be another area to look at.
I have a comment about mentoring programs, and then Darielle, perhaps you do too, because one of the things that I do when I go to the professional meetings, particularly the joint mathematics meetings, is I try to attend as many sessions as possible that are offered by groups, for example, NAM, the National Association of Mathematics, which is a professional organization generally organized or generally involving African American mathematicians historically. I go to their sessions to understand the mentoring programs, and that seems to be the main way, that the main strategy for increasing students' resilience is through mentoring programs, where they're basically they don't hide the fact that as a underrepresented group, you're going to face certain challenges, the same way that women historically did and in some ways still do in our profession. But they build up students' resilience. And so what we're trying to do with this work is try to help faculty find ways within the classroom to keep students engaged, so that they don't have to solely rely on these out-of-class things, that we can start helping our students be more successful. Darielle, did you want to say something more on that?
Yeah, I can jump in on that. I agree with you, Helen, in that the mentoring programs and students' communities do a great job of building that resilience when they have faced challenges. But when we're thinking about on campus, some of the things that we've seen programs do that have really fostered success for our students is being what we call intrusive. So one example that we like to give is if you know that your math class is going to be particularly difficult or you have students who are struggling, then we want to make it a requirement to go to the math lab or to go seek tutoring, not an optional thing. So that's something that we call intrusive practice, is because we already know the students are going to need the help, so we make it a requirement for them, or we make it worth points, right? It's one of the assignments that we have. So that's a part of one of the things. The other thing is just going back to the idea of culturally relevant teaching. So while you're in the classroom, making the materials relevant not only to the students' lives, but also to their communities, also to their futures. So thinking about the ways that them learning this is going to benefit themselves, but also benefit their families. Because I don't know about most of you, but a lot of my students who are community college students are also, they have dependents, or they're taking care of their parents, or they're working full-time jobs. And so they're there for much more than what maybe a typical student is there because they particularly want a degree. A lot of our community college students are there because they're earning this degree for their families. So making that connection for them and how it's relevant to their lives is also important.
So we have a couple, thank you, Dario. We have a couple more comments here. One person, I believe it's Chris, said that something that worked really well was just having a informal check-in with students once a week, sitting and talking and sharing some stories as a way to give students a chance to also share some successes that they've had or some things that might have been causing them stress. And
so if I could comment on that, the important thing that I'm reading there is you have a relationship with your student and you're demonstrating it through that practice, because then if there's things that go, if things are going off track or something happens, if you have the relationship, then you can have that difficult conversation with them. It's like the relational stuff is a precondition for dealing with the more challenging stuff, which is when students, you know, quit turning in assignments or aren't getting things and things like that. So the relationship is really key. We didn't address the online thing, and we did have a nice comment in here about online. It's interesting because I agree that there's this thing about, you know, us typing and texting each other. And what I've noticed in my online interactions, which tend to be basically around my learning management system, I don't teach any online classes right now, is that my use of language becomes even more important, because I type it and then I have to read this where it doesn't have any depth to it and no eye contact. Mm-hmm. Think about how my messages are being received by the student and keeping it positive and not making assumptions. Darielle, did you have anything else about online that you might suggest?
Nothing came to mind particularly about online. I agree with what you're saying in that you do have to be particularly careful about what you're writing and how it could come across to different students. But also, it's a little bit more difficult to make that connection if you can't see them. But I also saw a point that for shy students, it may seem like they may open up and come out more when they're online. But I don't have any specific data to exactly back that up. Maybe anecdotally.
I do think performance monitoring is a little bit easier in online, because so much of what you're doing as an instructor is monitoring their performance, setting the reminders, checking their work. So that one almost is taken care of a bit more by the medium.
Mm-hmm. I did see a comment that I wanted to comment on from AJ, and it really hits on the welcomeness to engage outside of the class. So since we did classroom observations for this webinar, we focused on welcoming inside, but actually welcoming students. So he mentioned that he tries to, or this person, AJ, tries to recognize students outside of the classroom, that they don't take too long to interrupt them, but they still stop them. And this actually came up a lot in interviews. So at first, when we interviewed men of color, they commented that their teachers and their instructors actually did not talk to them outside of the class, and how that made them feel like maybe they didn't belong at school, right? So their instructor would either put their head down or get on their cell phones. But the instructors who did do this, where they stopped to at least say hello or say, hey, I saw you in the cafeteria, in our analysis, it's highly predictive of student success and of transfer. So your welcomeness inside the classroom really needs to transfer to being outside of the classroom and engaging with students, because it's actually one of the highest predictors from what we found with men of color and also with some other underrepresented groups to help them persist and to continue in their class. So I'm glad that someone brought that point up.
Well, that's very important. Thanks for sharing that, Darielle.
I like the comment that I'm reading here. I can't remember if this has been said, but remember their names and calling them by name sometimes helps. And in a feeling of welcoming. And so 2 comments on that. We're not all great at remembering names. So for some people, that's really challenging. And we did see someone very strategically use their role as a source to kind of get more names in. And, you know, even letting students know that it might not be your strength, but that you care about them. I'm a big fan of table tents. They're kind of goofy, but, you know, making table tents just to get students' names out there. It does make a huge difference when students get called on their names. It's really validating them. And then I noticed that comment was linked to helping students feel welcoming. And so as we wrap up the webinar, as mathematicians, I know we like definitions. And one of the things, there's a nuance between the idea of being welcoming and then creating a culture of welcomeness. And maybe until we publish on this and you can actually read it, but, you know, a culture of welcomeness, which means you are inviting students to engage with you, and you're giving them signals that not only are you inviting them, but that engagement is desired. That's going to take more than some of the things that we saw in the examples of just, hey, you know, having a smile on your face, coming early in class. It's going to take more of the faculty efforts to create a culture of welcomeness. There was this person also went on to say, I live stream some of the book discussions at the library so the online students can participate as well. Helps them feel engaged even as an online student. Excellent idea. Well, if there are no more questions, thank you very much for being here. You're welcome to reach out to us. Sorry, Gabrielle, I didn't put a live link on your...
That's okay.
But you're welcome to reach out for us. And thank you very much for your time today. John, did you have any final things to say?
Yeah, so would you mind putting your email addresses in the chat box possibly so I can bring up the survey slide?
Sure, I will type them in right now.
Let's see, so now, for those of you who actually do need a survey so that you can get a certificate of attendance, I am going to bring up that information right now. So let's thank the presenters again in the chat room for a great webinar today, and thank you to all of you for participating in today's AMATIC webinar. And if you'd like to support future AMATIC webinars, please consider becoming a member of AMATIC at bit.ly/join-AMATIC. And please remember to like AMATIC on Facebook at facebook.com/AMATIC. And recordings of past AMATIC webinars can be found at bit.ly/AMATIC-webinars. And I will make sure that all of you get a link to the recording of today's webinar once it is uploaded there. And if you'd like to, please take 2 minutes to evaluate the webinar content in the presenters today. Please do that at the link on your screen, bit.ly/AMATIC86. And if you need an email confirmation of your participation in this webinar, please fill in the optional section at the end of the evaluation. So again, I would encourage you to please thank the presenters in the in the chat, and I'm sure that if you have a last-minute question that you want to get in, they would be more than happy to reply to your question now or take your email later using the email addresses that they have put in the chat room. And again, please fill out the survey so that we have this feedback so that it can be passed on to the presenters and be used to improve our overall webinar program here at AMATIC. So I am going to actually stop the recording right now.